Welcome, everybody. I'm Margaret Miller. I'm the director of the Institute for Research and Art at the University of South Florida College of the Arts. And the Institute is made up of the Contemporary Art Museum, Graphic Studio, and Public Art. And we're here tonight to open, or really celebrate, the opening of the Neighbors Slideshows for America. It actually officially opened on Monday, and tonight is the opening celebration via this conversation between the curator and the artists. And on Monday, we will be inviting students and faculty to come in to see the physical version of the exhibition in the museum. I want to say that we were able to commission these 5 artists, Woodline Cadet, Guy Greenberg, Curran Hadelberg, Catherine Maria Landeros, and Zora Murph, because we received a very generous grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation, and because of our local very generous collector and sponsor, Stanton store, with his Embrace the Arts Foundation. So these are new works commissioned for this exhibition, funded by those 2 entities. So we in the museum, and all of us, we've just been talking about it prior to coming on tonight, are confronted with the convergence of multiple pandemics, and they seem to keep growing. The COVID, of course, economic collapse, the systemic racism and police brutality, climate change, and now we're in another one, the anxiety of the election environment. And like other university museums or city museums, we must recognize that we are part of a seismic shakedown, and we must position ourselves to continually evaluate and reevaluate our role as an ally of social justice and as an academic support organization. Christian Viveros-Fonet, the Contemporary Art Museum's curator at large, has an impressive background as a writer and curator that allows him to conceive of exhibitions and related programs that put forward artists that respond to the environment around them and address many hot-button issues. His network and global reach is a terrific asset for the Contemporary Art Museum, and we're very honored to have him as part of our team. So what I suggest to all of you, you're certainly, after the conversation, we will take questions, and you can put your questions in on Zoom, the Q&A function, or if you're coming to us with Facebook, then you can leave your questions in the comment section. And it's good if you start putting these questions in as the conversation is going on for about 45 minutes. And then David Waterman, our trusty security guard and voiceover actor and now questioner, will synthesize your questions and direct them the right way. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Christian Viveros-Fonet, our curator at large and the curator of the Neighbors Slideshows for America. Christian?
Thank you, Margaret. Hi all, I'd like to welcome you to the live online reception to celebrate the opening of our fall exhibition, The Neighbors Slideshows for America. As you already know, obviously this reception is unlike many of the receptions held previously at US of CAM. It is, as you can plainly see, virtual. As is the exhibition currently, since the museum is temporarily closed in order to promote best practices regarding public health and compliance with the University of South Florida closures. When we originally conceived of the exhibition back in January, no one envisioned where we'd be today, not as a country, not as a planet, certainly not as a museum. Little did we know that we would not be able to walk around objects in public or share common space with other people. Alas, after 6 months of total or partial lockdown, this is where we are as a society. Severely limited in our ability to attend mass gatherings and cultural events, not just in Florida and in New York City, where I'm speaking to you from, but across most of the United States in much of the world. In spite of these difficult circumstances, and in no small measure because of them, USF-CAM made the decision to push on with its mission, to double down, that is, on our efforts to bring you this important exhibition of photographic works by 5 US-based camera artists. We've done this by physically installing the show inside our galleries while bringing you, our virtual audience, a digital capture of both the installation and the discrete works that comprise it. Why have we done this? Well, simply because, in the words of Winston Churchill, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, especially when you're working in contemporary culture. By installing the work in the museum's galleries and developing a robust online presence for the exhibition, we'd like to think we also got a jump on what will be, going forward, a hybrid model for museum exhibitions. This model will rely on both a traditional physical installation and a strong online presence as parallel and mutually complementary efforts. Around the country and around the world, leading arts institutions have had to learn the lessons of virtual exhibition, and quickly. Lesson number 1 is that virtual programming, while not a replacement for live and in-person encounters, is also substantially real. More so in the absence of actual physical meetings. Put differently, what museums have learned recently, museums and universities, I should also say, is what other cultural entities, among them social media and gaming companies, for instance, have known for years. I know that Margaret already thanked all the relevant parties involved in putting together this show, but I'd like to also quickly thank Team CAM, whose members have expertly rolled with the punches as we've reinvented, at least for ourselves, the idea and the actual practice of exhibition making. I'd also like to thank Lisa Sutcliffe, Hertzfeld Curator of Photography and Media Arts at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Lisa not only contributed a beautiful essay for the exhibition, it's available on the museum website, ria.usf.edu. She also generously talked me through a rough sketch of the show and introduced me to the work of several artists in the exhibition. Lastly, I'd like to thank the artists. They generally agreed to participate in the Neighbors at a time when, frankly, they couldn't have. I'll tell you why. If the initial idea for the show could have once been considered timely, because it was originally scheduled for January 2021 as a post-mortem on the presidential election, then holding it in the midst of what is obviously the most volatile presidential election in the last 50 years might have even seemed risky or possibly foolish. Be that as it may, not one of them blinked when asked if they would participate in the exhibition this fall. I chalk that resoluteness up to the belief that these artists have in the power of certain images, their images. In this exhibition, their carefully constructed and sequenced images speak to difficult times, but also to a desire to answer the fundamental questions raised here. What does America look like? And who is and who isn't American? Which brings me finally to talk a little about the show itself. The idea behind Neighbors is relatively simple. USF-CAM commissioned 5 brilliant but very different camera artists from around the US. They are, you'll meet them in a minute, Woodland Cadet, Guy Greenberg, Kern Hadelberg, Katia Maria Landeros, and Zora J. Murph. We commissioned them to make slideshows of groups of Americans whom they believe are routinely underexposed, folks whose bodies and faces go unseen so that they are often uncounted or undercounted and underserved by society at large. Rather than focus on images of groups of outliers per se, what the exhibition brief asked for were images of Americans of every stripe, but with a special focus on those who appear underrepresented by this country's dominant narratives. That, in brief, explains the title of the show. Now for the subtitle. Slideshows for America. Why slideshows? Well, part of the answer is that we wanted to harken back to an earlier age of old-time slide projectors and slide carousels, which is, by the way, what we're using to project images in the show. We wanted to evoke the intimacy of family through that and community. Slideshows, again, of another age. In an important way, this show is stripped down to the max. It's conceived in the spirit of Miss Van der Rose's minimalist dictum. Less is more. Maybe less is more at a time when more is always more. The Neighbors is projections and the sounds of projectors as they move through the stories the artists tell in their sequences of images. These distinct stories, as we've mentioned, are meant to defy narratives that describe entire swathes of the country as monoliths or blocks. If each slide contains images that suggest parts of the country are ailing or broken, others highlight the stubborn human values of the communities they portray: perseverance, patience, bravery, resistance, joy. By way of closing, and before giving you a peek at a video of the installation inside the galleries, I want to read a paragraph from the essay Lisa Sutcliffe wrote for the exhibition. I think it really summarizes the spirit of the show particularly well. For the Neighbors, Sutcliffe writes, USFCAM invited a group of US-based photographers to offer an interpretation of our moment, of the Americans who might otherwise go unseen. The exhibition's title suggests a gathering of familiar people, but who are hazily defined. Together, they make a community, a society, a country. These photographs provide sketches, diaries, and snapshots offering fresh perspectives and providing a richer and more complex depiction of American life. Observing is an important form of listening, of understanding. I love that phrase. These sequences of images are an invitation to recognize and appreciate the ways in which a diverse set of hearts and minds have reacted to and reflected upon our common society at this unusual time. Mark, I would ask you to go ahead and cue the installation, but before we press play, pardon me, the installation video, but before we press play, I want to encourage all of you to watch the video captures of the individual artist projection. That's fundamentally what the show is all about. Blow them up large, turn up the sound, turn out the lights in your respective bedrooms, offices, and living rooms. Then imagine yourself sitting alongside others watching images of your extended family, a very extended family, in fact. These are your parents, your sisters, your brothers, your uncles and your aunts, your cousins, and of course, the neighbors. Thank you for that, Mark. Okay, now I'd like to ask the artists to turn on their cameras and microphones so that they'll come up and I can introduce you and we can get on to having that conversation. There you go. Hey, Guy. Curran, Katya, Zora, Vidlin. Bingo. Thank you. Please excuse the brief introductions. I already said these back there that you in our mock green room. But you know, each of you guys have so many plaudits that if I read out your full bios, we're going to be here all day. So first, by way of introduction, Vidlin Cadet. Vidlin is a Haitian-born artist based in Syracuse, New York. Her practice draws from personal history and examines race, memory, erasure, migration, immigration, and Haitian cultural identity from within the United States. She uses photography, video, and installations to construct a visual language that explores notions of visibility and hypervisibility, Black, feminine, interiority, and selfhood. Guy Greenberg is based in New York City. He spends much of his time photographing the Hasidic communities of Williamsburg and Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Through an alternating series of street photography and portraits, he works to show strong contrast in these communities, as well as those communities' resistance to assimilation and change. Curran Hadelberg is an American photographer who's based in Baltimore. He's influenced by the American tradition of road photography, and his process entails driving throughout the US and interacting with various strangers in different locales. Some interactions last 30 minutes, others 30 days. Curran once told me his photographs are traces of those encounters. Katia Maria Landeros is a Mexican-American photographer, an educator and a Guggenheim Fellow. Influenced by her bicultural upbringing, her work in the past decade focuses on Latinx communities and the exploration of history, migration, representation, and belonging. And finally, Zora J. Murph lives and works in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he serves as assistant professor of art at the University of Arkansas. Distinguished voice in photography dealing with the complex intersections of race in American society, he has long combined his experience with social work. He worked briefly with incarcerated youth and his art to explore the fraught connections between visibility and powerful social systems. All right, because all you guys are artists with a social bent, I'm anticipating you're going to find a lot of common ground. So, you know, please feel free to chime in, even when questions are not sort of directly addressed to you. If we get onto issues, I want this to be as much of a conversation as is humanly possible. So my first question is for all of you. American lives have changed a great deal in very little time, as we all know. Not just in the last few months, but in the last years. And my question is, how have you adapted as thinkers and as photographers to these changes? How are those changes reflected in your work and the stories or sequences that you've contributed to the neighbors? Maybe we can start with Curran.
I don't know if the past few years, I mean, obviously these are things that are always sort of dominating what we're thinking about when we're out in America, but I feel like I'm always arriving to photographing with the same kind of curiosity, in search of a kind of personal connection, exchange, and sort of hope for mutual collaboration with the work. But yeah, I don't know, with all the complication and horror of the country right now, I really believe that it's only through shared experiences with others, people like us, people not like us, that we're going to understand ourselves, what our country is, and what our collective experience in America is.
Woodland, how have things changed for you, just in terms of picture making? I mean, you know, we can talk about what's been happening the last 6 months, or we can talk about, you know, if there have been any changes as far as you see them in the last year, 2 years, 3 years.
I think there's been more of an urgency for me. I think most of my work is about my family, and my family are immigrants. So a lot of my work, I think there's been like this big urgency for me to make and document like this process of my family, who I almost everyone except for my younger sister who was born in Haiti and have migrated here and are like in some like process of becoming citizens or of becoming residents. So I think there's been more of an urgency to just document that for the future, but also for myself as well. And so, yeah, especially during the past 4 years, I would say.
Are you a citizen?
No.
Well, neither am I. Chocolate, as it's in Chile. Yeah, it's a curious position to be in these days. No?
Mm,
And fraught, even,
yes. Yeah.
totally. Guy?
Yes. Well, things certainly stopped once sheltering in place occurred in New York City. There's something very specific to I guess the density of our city, the fear of getting sick. Knowing that I was taking care of my father, knowing that some of the communities that I was photographing weren't adhering to the safety guidelines, and really sort of questioning the worth of sort of capturing that very intense moment. So I shot very little, whether it was in the Hasidic communities or outside in more calming situations. Things sort of froze in time in New York. And, if I was cautious to see a friend that lived down the street from me, I wasn't going to stick a camera in somebody's face. But prior to that, I would say the Hasidic community is fairly political. And there's, again, two different communities that I covered. And so things are on their minds. I ask questions. I want to better understand the allegiance that communities have to the right, which particularly surprised me.
Katia, how about you? You've been photographing immigrant communities for a while. I don't know how much of that you've been able to do in the last 6 months, but I wonder whether there's been a change in I don't know, your practice, the reception, the way you see the communities that you're photographing, the way they see you. I mean, some of this is really about the last. Some of what I want answered in this question is about the last few years, but also, if you want, about the last 6 months. I don't know whether all of you have been able to photograph. I know the current has recently, but it's important, I think, for the audience to know, like, when can you work? When have you been able to work?
That's a really great question, and I wish I could say that I've been able to work really diligently, but and I'm sorry, you can probably hear my toddler in the background.
Perfect.
So
It's all our lives.
that's a big reason why I can't work as well. But well, the pandemic has just really, really made it so that I can't travel the way that I used to. But aside from the pandemic, I do want to say that I've been, like you have said, I've been working in these communities for more than 10 years. And in some ways, what has happened is that, to echo what Widleen has said, is that there is a sense of urgency, and it feels like people are really listening now. And so I think that is one sort of positive thing that has come out of this, that it doesn't feel like the the things that I think a lot of artists were talking about, like racial and social injustices, like they don't feel like they're just below the surface anymore. I think after 2016, everything felt more palpable, everything felt more urgent. And so in some ways, I think that people were more willing to listen and pay attention. And so I think that is kind of an unintended upside to this.
There's a silver lining to every cloud, I suppose. Zora, what about you? How have things changed for you in the last couple of years and the last months?
You know,
aside from the teaching, by the way, which I think we were
yeah,
discussing previously, which apparently has become extremely onerous for anyone who's teaching.
yeah, you know, I think spending the past few years really sort of grappling with these questions of, you know, like what does it mean to be an American? And also like, what does it mean to be in America? You know, like, and I feel like, you know, like I think change is an interesting word. You know, to me, like things do feel more urgent because it does feel like people are paying attention and, you know, maybe taking more time to think a little more deeply. But I think that like change, like I want to like kind of ask like what has changed? I think that maybe, you know, we feel things a little more intensely than we have. You know, I think about the video of Kenosha. I think of, you know, the video of George Floyd. And I think that, you know, before when we saw these images, this footage, that it was easier to maybe poke holes in it or ask questions of it. And so, like, I think what's different now, maybe what has changed, is that the pandemic, you know, forced us all to be indoors, and we only had our screens to look at, to be outside. And I think that, you know, like maybe we're seeing, you know, the blatant disregard for Black life in this country a little more clearly. And so, yeah, I mean, like for me, like that's just kind of like, I think sort of the bigger picture things that I've been grappling with. And so, but it like, you know, like the work, you know, like my working methods, I'm just, you know, I think the first thing that I photographed after, you know, we got kicked off of a campus here, was I was photographing inside of these homes that were being constructed in our neighborhood. And then, you know, like after Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, thinking about that act, and again, kind of asking that question, what does it mean to be in America?
Some of those pictures are actually in
the slideshow, right?
In the slideshow, which I you know, I want to talk about specifically later. But you know, I actually didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to.
Oh no, that's okay. I mean, I think that like, I think, you know, to me it was like, I think I have less interest in being outside, and I think for good cause. And so I've become, I think I'm just becoming more resourceful and finding ways to continue creating the work that I need to make, but in a way that truly, you know, feels safe to me right now.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things that we sort of had to deal with, and I'm sort of skipping ahead in the question order that I set for myself. But you know, we had talked about doing this show, all of us, as a postmortem on the elections. Moving it up for me meant that I think we had to make a different ask of you guys because we couldn't in all good conscience ask you guys to go out in the field and take goddamn pictures, could we? So, you know, I think pretty much all of you got in some pictures that were of the time of this period. But, you know, I think part of what we've all had to do is to be, like you said, Zora, resourceful within our capacities. I want to drill down into some sort of individual works and direct some questions to some to you guys specifically. Vidland, you said once in an interview, and in fact, the person who was interviewing you was Zora, that you became drawn to portraiture as a way of filling a gap that was left by the lack of pictures you had from your own family. Can you tell us a little bit about that desire to build a family archive and where the images that you contributed to the neighbors fit into that effort?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So when I talk about the lack of images in my family, I think I'm speaking to the fact that there aren't any pictures of my grandparents, of my mother's parents anywhere. And I've asked her siblings, they don't have any sort of memorabilia or documentation of their identity, paper-wise. And I think that's always been this curiosity of mine, because I never met them. They both died before I was born. My grandmother almost half a century ago, and my grandfather a year before I was born, he passed away. So I think there is this need for me to have this documentation of my family. And I think particularly at this time, as we're all of my siblings live in the US now, but we're born in Haiti. And so I think that's also one of the reasons where I'm I need to have proof of where we came from and things like that, especially since I think maybe in 2 or 3 generations from now, there might not be a common knowledge where we came from, that we were born in Haiti or things like that. And I think that's something that happens a lot with migration too. And so the selection of images that I chose for this are my most recent pictures that I've been making about my family. I think I started after the birth of my youngest nephew with this curation. So it's been me taking trips to Florida, to California, but also taking photos at family gathering functions and things like that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I love that. It's also Florida. You're in Syracuse. It's Florida, California. I mean, that's key to the immigrant experience, and that's also key to sort of the composite view of the neighbors that I was hoping we were going to get, and we clearly got with all of you guys. Is that you know, your pictures really sort of scan the country significantly, but they do so while zeroing in on sort of specific communities in a really sort of powerful way. You also, and I sort of want to point out for the audience that your series, which is called Every Other Good Thing series, were taken with a Fuji film disposable camera, and I think that's also kind of brilliant. But maybe you can speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, I think I photographed my family both with that kind of camera, but also with the large format. I think the thing that happens when you have a bigger camera, that I become too visible for them, and it shows in the picture as well. And so one of the things I wanted to do is become invisible the way that I experience them and show that. And I think the disposable was the best way to do that, because I think it shows when you're looking at the images that sometimes it doesn't seem like I'm there, but somehow the picture was made. So that talks to me being there, but not necessarily.
Well, this is very funny because last week you published a photo in the New Yorker of Joe Biden, and, which I'm sure was a completely different situation. I mean, you probably had to be invisible, but not quite in the same way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think making pictures in the pandemic has forced me to learn how to be invisible in different ways as well. And I think, I guess maybe to go back to your first question, that's one of the things that's changed recently. Yeah.
Curran, you're back in Baltimore now. You were just out taking some pictures, but obviously to get your pictures, you travel all over the U.S., right? I'd love for you to sort of tell us a little bit about your setup. Like I don't know, man, what drives you out there? What are you in search of, and what are you aiming to sort of bring back with pictures in your own words?
I don't know if I have a specific goal for what I want to bring back, but I think that kind of shared experience, that connection, that kind of mutual collaboration that I was trying to get at before is really what drives the work. It's trying to understand all the multifaceted aspects of this insane country that we all live in. So every person that I photograph, or family, or community, are all strangers at least at first. Photography is like this, is such a beautiful excuse to make those connections, to create learning experiences. So that's really like the impetus for all of it, is to find that kind of connection and experience that we can share together.
It strikes me that a number of your pictures, and sort of going back to what Vincent was saying, you seem like a photographer is actually not there. You seem invisible, and these are very different kinds of people than. Yeah, they're not your straight up sort of like Barney shopping, bougie cats. And those are environments in which it would occur to me that you might stick out, not because you're a Barney buying bougie cat, but because you're not from there.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? How do you make yourself invisible in that respect?
Well, every time I meet somebody, there has to be that kind of shared interest in the process. So I always approach somebody with the camera out. I tell them what I'm doing, what I'm working on. We have a conversation, and then it's kind of a process in which I just say yes to everything. So I kind of rely on everyone that I'm photographing as a collaborator, as a guide, as a subject that will appear in the picture. So yeah, it all begins from that place, and then I think once you start taking pictures, once you reach a place hopefully of mutual vulnerability and kind of respect and curiosity about the other, you kind of disappear. A lot of times sometimes it's a half hour, but a lot of times it's days or weeks, and I'll live with the individuals that I'm photographing. We'll share meals. We'll drive around. It's just, I'm kind of game for anything. And then I think the camera just becomes this fixture that eventually kind of dissolves.
It disappears. That what you just said sort of reminds me of something before we met and before we talked on the phone and before we actually saw each other's faces via screens. And I should say something I said to all you guys about 30, 40 minutes ago, was that, this show was supposed to have taken me to each of your studios, and we were supposed to have had significant time together and an immersion in your work, and anyway, that didn't happen. And we're doing it this way, and I think quite successfully. But before even all of that, I heard your voice on a Whitney Museum recording on their website, because you were in a show there, and you said it's only through others that we'll really understand ourselves, our country, and our current moment. And if you're saying what I think you're saying that photographs of other people really kind of force interest in lives other than their own.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully through that process, completely remove indifference. You know, you see yourself reflected in the other person, and yeah, that's about as powerful as it gets for me.
From your mouth to God's ears. Katya, again, you've worked with immigrant communities on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. In fact, you spent a couple of years living in and working in Mexico while documenting communities that had the highest rates of historic northward migration. Communities that had been completely transformed by like a century of migration to the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you to that project, which has obviously been a lifelong project for you?
Well, for me, it's because I'm a dual citizen, so I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents were both born in Mexico. You know, they were farm workers. My ancestors were all farm workers, and they had this connection to the American West, but really both countries. And so I thought that was really, it was really interesting, to say the least. My father worked with farm workers. He ended up going back to school and got a degree in education, and then worked with farm workers, helping them obtain social services, and, you know, like making sure that their kids had access to an education. And I mean, the moment that I decided that this was something that I really wanted to do was when I went with my father to visit some of these farm camps, because I can also say that I have had a pretty privileged life. You know, even though I didn't grow up with a lot, through scholarships or luck, and, you know, whatever, my life has sort of taken me to the East Coast, and I've gone to really nice schools. So coming back as an adult and sort of seeing an environment where I understood where my parents were coming from, you know, that maybe it was like something that when I was young, maybe I didn't really fully understand, or maybe I was even like embarrassed or ashamed of it, which I'm embarrassed to admit that now. But, you know, when you're young, you just don't, like, it just doesn't really, you just don't understand, you know, you don't understand the sacrifices that your parents make. And so anyways, it was really, like, for me, that was a really powerful thing. And I ended up spending the first, I quit my job in New York, and I spent like 2 years sleeping on my parents' couch as a grown ass woman. Let me just say that. I had no right to be sleeping on my parents' couch at that point. But, you know, whatever. Yeah, it was just, I think for me, it was a way to reconnect with who my family is and where they're from, and reclaim that and honor that, you know. And I think what Zora said is really powerful, because I think that change, it really starts with acknowledgement, you know. That's the root of change, and it's an acknowledgement of who we are, an acknowledgement even like through pictures, you know, like this is who we are.
Well, that's a powerful thing about pictures, and particularly pictures you guys have taken, is that, you know, particularly portraits, people see other people. They recognize themselves, you know, in an almost primitive way, in a pair of eyes and nose and ears, and they're, you know, immediately curious to figure out what looks like them, or what maybe doesn't look like them, and you know, the rest of its conditions, what it wears, where it's sited, you know, how it interacts with that particular landscape, etc. Speaking of which, there's an image in your carousel of images of a young teenage girl dressed in jeans and holding a sparkler. what I imagine is the 4th of July. And I keep going back to that image. And I confess, I'm not 100% sure why. I mean, I think part of it may be the fact that she looks tired and like done with the whole 4th of July thing. You know, maybe I'm thinking that like, you know, that sort of reluctant posing looks like, you know, it's sort of just contrary to the representation of standard issue patriotism, right? So, you know, you want to fill in the blanks, you know, what's she thinking, what's she doing, how is she feeling? In any event, I find it to be like a super enigmatic picture. Is there, do you remember who that girl is? And really sort of more important, I'd love you to tell us where that picture was taken, because it looks like the US, but then it doesn't.
So that was taken in a really small farming community in Eastern Washington. And that's a young woman named Betty. She was really, really pretty amazing. You know, sort of invited me into her home, let me photograph her on the 4th of July. The frustration might have been with me. Maybe that's what you're reading, Kristen. I don't know. I hope not.
I doubt that.
I mean, what can I say about that? I think that I think communities like that are really interesting because they're sort of like the backbone of this country. And a place like that town where I was photographing, I think it's like 70 or 80% Latino, Latinx. And, you know, when we think of the American West, like this idea of what the West is, like it really rarely acknowledges the immigrants that have built those communities. You know, like we think of cowboys, we think of, but the truth is that a lot of these communities are immigrant communities. I mean, Sacramento, where I grew up, it's one of the most diverse cities in the country. You know, and so I guess that's what I was thinking when I was walking around on 4th of July. Like this is just so beautiful because, you know, it's just like myself. Like, yes, maybe my family had Mexican food on the 4th of July, but we were like digging it too. You know, we were like trying to assimilate and you know, very proud of that sort of mix of our cultures. You know, so I love when those two things can combine. You know, there's nothing that says that you can't be proud of your ethnic heritage, but also be American.
Absolutely. You know, and in fact, you know, some of those sort of cultural contradictions are exactly what makes the idea of being American interesting, frankly, or personalities interesting, period.
Can I just share a very sweet story really quickly?
Please.
Okay, I'll make everybody laugh. So when my grandmother, my sister married someone who is not of Mexican descent, and he brought over cranberry sauce, and my grandmother thought it was hot sauce. And she started putting it on the turkey, and she was like, "What is this? It's so sweet and icky." It's like, perfect. Grandma, it's not salsa.
Yeah, it's not salsa. Yeah, I've got stories like that with peanut butter and a couple of other things. My parents. Zora, I read that your involvement with photography began when you took a position with the Iowa Juvenile Detention and Diversion Services Facility. Good Lord, what a name! In 2012, can you walk us through that experience? Can you walk us through what sort of like led you to pick up a camera? I mean, that's kind of what I'm interested in, and also I'm sort of curious to know whether you had sort of the structure in your brain when you picked up the camera that you wanted to reflect certain social injustices, or maybe whether what you were thinking initially was, you know, how to portray someone that you had, you know, an empathy for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, it was just kind of circumstance, like I went to school, like kind of jumped right into college and, without really thinking about what it was that I ultimately wanted to accomplish. And so, I landed, like kind of studying psychology, and then getting that degree and knowing that I wasn't going to go any further with it, like studies wise. I was working jobs that I could get with that degree, which were social service positions. um, and so, yeah, I ended up, at one point working for juvenile detention and diversion services in Eastern Iowa. And it was at that time I had decided that I was going to go back to school. I had started taking pictures, like as a hobby, as something to have for myself, because social service jobs are really demanding. It's hard to turn, the lives of other people, like, concern for other people off, when you punch out at the end of the day. And so, photography for me was like that selfish endeavor that was completely mine. And no one else mattered in it. It was like completely for me. And then, over time, just hearing, things from like, friends and family that like my photographs were good. And so, you start to feel confident about those things, and then you want to learn more. And so I learned more about, cameras, and, I started, looking at, photography, as art. And yeah, so I mean, it was, just kind of all of these things working themselves together. And, I was doing, working in the detention, or working with the kids on probation, and I was in school. And I, I decided I was going to start making work about, the professional work that I was doing. And I think that it was also a way for me to learn like what the criminal justice system really meant to me. There were a lot of things that I was seeing as an employee, where it just seemed like the system kind of contradicted common sense and people's like best interests. And I wanted to understand, like, if there are people in control of the system and can like enact policies to shape things, like, why do we do these things like to completely contradict, like what is like supposed to sort of happen inside of the system? Again, sort of like a social system that's supposed to promote like social welfare, like that, like, rehabilitation, all of these other things that it sort of states that it's supposed to do, but it doesn't do. And so, yeah, I think being immersed in that, and kind of having these larger questions and seeing how these systems and processes, actually affect people on a daily basis, it was hard not to use my camera to look at that as well. And so it just kind of took off from there, into my, my work that I make today.
In fact, if I remember correctly, some of the first pictures you took of some of those young folks that you were working with, you couldn't actually take, you had to figure out a way to make the portraits. You couldn't you couldn't register their faces.
Yeah, which was like an interesting sort of endeavor, because it was like something I was really frustrated at. Not like at the kids, but just at the fact that I wanted to make a portrait where, so like the subject could be looking, at the camera.
Right.
But because of, like their records are sealed and privacy.
And they're minors, yeah.
Right, and they're minors, right? And
Yeah.
so privacy laws and things, I couldn't do that. And of course, with good reason. And so it was like, it became this like sort of like, quote unquote problem that presented itself for me to solve. But I think it was in solving that I was able to teach myself how form dictates meaning. And so, what does it mean to be a young individual inside of this system, meant to sort of anonymize you in some way? And that turns you into this sort of number statistic in a lot of different ways. And so like those sort of visual things, like that sort of that level of inquiry for me, like very early on in my education in photography, I think it helped me really consider, like what is visual literacy, and then how does that show up commonly, because we consume images like, you know, on a daily
All the
basis.
time, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and these images are meant to tell us things. And so, you know, kind of being able to like work that into my own artistic practice as well. So that's the way that I make images or deal with images. But also like how, as an educator, I talk with my students, like to think about images.
So let's like skip ahead like 18 years and let's talk about the slideshow that is in the Neighbors, which you titled "Exceptionalism as a Belief System for Erasing Oneself." I mean, I'm assuming that the exceptionalism you're talking about is the American exceptionalism of the John Wayne, my white God, you know, says that what's yours is mine variety, right? That's where you're coming from. But in that image story, you're combining, you know, portraits that you've taken with, you mentioned houses under construction, found photos, and this repeating sort of like motif, this repeating glimpse, this repeating image of a flag on the porch of an otherwise, you know, very respectable looking house, but seen through like this wood, right? I wonder if you could just sort of tell us about that. What you know,
Yeah.
elucidate what. There's a
Yeah.
blurry image of a yellow house and some half-built suburban homes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, you know, like when you talked about like what this, you know, the show was supposed to be, you know, like how it was like initially supposed to be like about, you know, post-election, but then, you know, it's like, why, you know, like, why should we ignore this, you know, this pre-election moment that's like severely like more important, right? And so, like, I think I was like, you know, well, like we had talked about, like maybe using work that I had already, some work that I had already created, or, you know, like how to sort of navigate that. And I was like, well, like, why do I even need to think about like, you know, the images? I want to think about this object that's delivering the image and sort of like how that is like, you know, largely seen as this nostalgia device, you know, like if we think about, you know, like Mad Men and the carousel episode and like how touching, you know, the protagonist Don Draper's like speeches, and helping him remember himself and like, you know, like why he does all this, you know, hard work for his family, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, kind of considering that dynamic and thinking about like, where do I fit into that, right? How is that image crafted for me, and then how do I as an artist work to craft that image as well. And then just thinking about this idea of like neighbors, and I was making this work, you know, at a time when I was like getting ready to move into a new house. And, you know, like the place that, you know, my wife and I were at, like our neighbors were great. Like we had really, you know, we had a really great relationship with them, not necessarily close, but like cordial. You knew that like they had our best interests in mind. And so, but then, you know, like walking into this, you know, new house and thinking about like, now I don't know this person I live next to, you know, like who are they going to be? How are they going to think about me? All of these sorts of things. And then like, you know, the exceptionalism, you know, like exceptionalism as a belief system for erasing oneself. I think, yes, it can touch on the exceptionalism you're talking about, but I'm talking like maybe more so about this idea of me as a Black person striving towards white exceptionalism, or like striving towards whiteness as a form of like saying, I can transcend your definition of Blackness, which is largely negative, to show you, like, so if I aspire to be white and I can get myself there, then I prove to you that I am equal to you, right? But thinking in that way fundamentally erases who I am. And so like I was, you know, kind of dealing with those ideas and wanted to, you know, kind of make this really kind of, I guess, sort of complicated photographic object, this image delivery device, in which, you know, you see these sorts of obscure, like images that feel maybe familiar, maybe feel a little obscure, but having that flag motif appear every so often in between the images, I guess like maybe helping the viewer know that these images are meant to be connected in some way. And then that like but the main idea is this idea of, again, like, you know, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be in America? And so for me, you know, like when I think about myself as an American, and I sort of strive, you know, to be an American, you know, like, how do I deal with the fact that, like, that sort of notion is itself like me kind of aspiring to this thing that, you know, tries to design every single way it can to kill me, you know? And so, yeah, I think that for me, like, that's kind of what I was thinking about as I was bringing everything together.
In the same interview that you did with Vidlin, that I referred to earlier, you said, I remember making a promise to myself. You guys were talking about, I think at the time Vidlin was still getting her MFA, and I think you said something about, you know, I remember being where you are some years ago. But then you said, I remember making a promise to myself after my first year of grad school that I would use my camera and my draw to portraiture to focus solely on Black people. I know that what you're talking about are general issues of visibility and also the issues of whiteness versus Blackness that you've just sort of laid out, right? But I mean, there's a million questions I can ask you about that, but I guess the first one is, you know, have you kept that promise, and you know, and if so, why, or if so, why not?
Sure, yeah, of course I have. And I mean, I think it's like, you know, I think it was like something that like that I did struggle with in grad school, like this idea of like the types of pictures that I was making, and you know, like who I was photographing, who was showing up in my work. And I noticed that like when I had like this desire to figure out like what does my Blackness mean to me, and then using art as a vehicle to explore that, I noticed that the conversation surrounding my work quickly shifted. And then that was, you know, like kind of this this moment that reminded me of the importance of asking oneself these questions, and, you know, sort of beginning to interrupt space in that way, rather than like letting the space kind of interrupt you. And I think to me, like, it was just like, I think that is like what the promise, you know, to me means. And it's not like that I, you know, exclusively photograph Black people. It's just when I use my, like when I think about like make work and I think about my work, to me, it's always a fundamental part of it, like that I need to ask myself, like, you know, like if part of this endeavor for me is trying to inject, you know, as many images of us into visual culture as I can, you know, during my short time here, you know, like I guess trying to make sure that I don't fall prey to those traps, you know, like sort of like the way that, you know, like photography was willed into, you know, becoming a tool for, you know, colonial desire. Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of leave that there.
Guy, you're our anchor man in this relay, this fly photographer relay conversation. So, I mean, just sort of want to say to the folks listening that a lot of your photographs, a lot of the ones in your slideshow are taken really just minutes from my house where I live. Yet, I mean, to me, and I think to most people, they seem possibly sort of the most unfamiliar or even the most different or strange to viewers not conversant in the dress and customs of Hasidic communities. You know, those in London, those in Tel Aviv, those in Williamsburg and Crown Heights and Brooklyn, which is where you're working. A lot of your photographs sort of bespeak a certain relationship in the way that we were talking about with Curran and with Vidlin, but you know, also really a deeper knowledge or access to your subjects. I guess what I'm asking is how did you get that access? How'd you come to know these folks that you're photographing?
Yeah, so there are two different neighborhoods, and one neighborhood that you live in is far more isolated. The Satmar community came from Romania, basically escaping genocide. And they're out of time. And, you know, as I acknowledge my own identity constantly moving, there's a kind of prevention of that occurs in that neighborhood. You know, hierarchy of politics and power, and certainly of aesthetics. They're continuous. You can look at photography books from the 60s, Gary Winogrand, Joe Merwitz, Diane Arbus, and so forth. And the photographs that they took, you trace what you see in front of yourself now. Crown Heights is different. When I started with Williamsburg, I had a kind of hunger. Been shooting for 6 years. I had a hunger just to cover New York. Born in New York, familiar walking in New York, and I just wanted the scene. I wanted all the obvious things, the shapes, the novelties. Orthodox community has disproportionate amount of twins and triplets, disproportionate amount of redheads. You know, it's all there. It's these obsessions that photographers have had in America, and it's right there. But you sort of run through that, and you can exhaust that. And I wasn't asking incredible amounts of questions about identity and how I fit into the taking of the Hasidic community in Williamsburg. It wasn't until I went to Crown Heights and started photographing, and people stopped me, not with grave suspicion. They said, "Do you want us to answer any questions you may have?" And just through conversation, I met one family that's featured in this slideshow, about 4 or 5 images. They have now 6 children, 1 newborn this past 2 weeks. And they were very interested in talking and getting my point of view. The Chabad in Crown Heights are about proselytizing sort of non-religious Jews. So it is about being in the world. It is about pulling someone like me in, whether they're going to convert me or not to the Orthodox ritual. They want to show. So it's a very different thing. One is a closed door in which people that photograph Williamsburg are running around taking pictures, never quite making connections. You can smile, you can gesture, you can do all of that, but you really don't connect. And then Crown Heights, when people invite me to their houses to have dinner, they tell me I'm not eating enough, I'm not drinking enough. Do you want to take more pictures? Do you want me to wake up my kids? You know, it changed, and I changed. I wanted more familiarity with my subjects. I wanted to be closer. I wanted to be more of myself and not just on the wall. And Crown Heights offered that. And it opened up more questions about who I am and my relationship to being Jewish. You know, we're sort of going around this round table and talking about assimilation. Yeah.
This is a group that doesn't particularly want to assimilate.
Yes, but there was a time where Jews in general in America weren't white, you know, along with other categories of Europeans. And I remember my grandfather, when I was young, was sort of like a menacing tone saying, they don't think we're real Jews. You know, and the implication was, F them. How dare they think they're more authentic? And also part of that conversation was, because I grew up Reform, was look at us. We've assimilated. We can do 2 things at once. We can be safe in America, and we can also do our ritual. We just can't show it. We can't wear it. We have to be quiet about it. And so I'm dealing with that when I step into the community. How do I reconcile? How do I be interested in people that are very religious when I'm not? And I think just being around, listening, sharing food, being willing to be surprised in conversations, and also to argue, because that's what Jews do. We argue, we ask questions. You know, you can't be silent at the table. You have to be a participant. And once that happens, you know, you go from there.
There's one picture in particular that I'm always drawn back to in your slideshow, and it's of that young boy looking over the BQE from that pedestrian bridge, which is really about 15 minutes away from where I live now. And it sort of reminds me, I don't know, of Louis Hine images of you know, even Dorothea Lange images, not of Jews, but of other immigrants. And because it seems to capture like a long history of immigration and assimilation. But there's also a contradiction in the picture, right? Just as you pointed out, because these same groups, that boy or his parents and his grandparents are particularly resistant to the idea. In fact, they live a parallel sort of like, not just life, but history from the rest of us. This is my neighborhood. They're my neighbors. But maybe part of what makes that picture so powerful is just that contradiction that you captured, you know? And maybe that picture and its contradictions has something to tell all of us basically about, you know, assimilation and resistance to it, because that might be a good position for all of us to be in, to have some resistance, you know?
Yeah.
You know, there's good reason not to believe in a white picket fence, isn't there? And all its other promises. Listen, we're over, and I do want to take some questions. So I think we're going to go straight to them now. But I want to tell you, and I told you earlier how grateful I am for you guys actually participating in the show. I think we put together something quite beautiful, and I'm really hoping that I don't know, in the not too distant future, damn it, that like we figure out a way to actually sort of have you guys down in Tampa, figure out a way for me to go down to Tampa, which I haven't done since March, and get you talking to the community there, which is both students and the public. In any event, thank you so much. And David, let's see what we can muster with the questions there.
Sure. What a great conversation. Very wide ranging. I have only a couple of questions that came in through the Q&A. One of them, the first one that came in was directed to Curran, and that was simply how you decide where to travel to and have that connection.
It's sort of shifted and evolved over the years, but at first I was opportunistic to places where I could stay for free. So in the past, you know, I have an aunt and uncle who live in Alaska, in Louisiana. I have family in Ohio, kind of sprinkled all over the map. And, you know, that would mean there's a couch I can sleep on for X amount of time, you know. You know, I also had friends from grad school when I was starting to get more serious about photography who ended up getting teaching jobs in some more non-coastal parts of the US. So it was the same thing, flopping on their couch and then kind of satelliting from that position to find people and spend time with them. So that was part of it. And then the other part was, you know, I had a minivan that I put a mattress in and just rolled around and slept in the back and
classic.
figured it out as I went, I guess. More recently, I've done a couple of residencies, one great one in Galveston, Texas, and another great one in Omaha, Nebraska. And those provided incredible places to spend time and meet the communities that live in those places. So it's sort of a combination of all those approaches.
Excellent. I have another that's come in that's directed, and then one or two that are more general if we have time for one of those. For Woodland, this person asks, how did you get the photo of Joe Biden that appears in New Yorker? When was it taken? Were you wearing a press badge to get it? And your sound is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
I was commissioned by the New Yorker to take it, I think last month. Yeah, around last month. No press badge or anything. Yeah. We were just in communication with his team, and so we arranged a time that way. And the editor that I was working with, Marvin, set the whole thing up for me.
I have a follow-up. It was in his house, yeah?
No, it was at this convention center, sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Very personable guy, the kind of guy everyone should vote for.
That's
I
our
took that as a yes.
option.
This is a question that goes out to all. How do you take the polarization of the media into your art?
Whoever wants to attack that, please.
I don't think I do. Yeah, I don't think I do.
Anyone else?
I don't think I do either. I mean, it's just like venom, right?
Yeah, I try to disregard it as well, pretty much as possible.
Yeah, but come on, you know, it is one of those things. We all consume media. I mean, I'm sure you guys consume media much more hungrily than, you know, the average Joe or Jane. At least it must raise, you know, the blood pressure. I'm imagining. I mean, I know it does me.
I think that's fair, you know, but is it just me, or I just can't even listen to the current person in office? You know, like I mute the radio when anyone in his administration comes on. So I guess it does have an effect on me because I'm reacting, you know, even though I'm saying that it doesn't, everything is a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I feel like my hope for the photographs is that, unlike the media, which is sort of providing answers or trying to provide some kind of answer, the work poses a question instead. You know, it's kind of the opposite intention for me, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that I don't take it into the work. I use my work to talk about how images are used to polarize. I think maybe that's like maybe a more fair assessment for me, at least.
Excellent answer. Well, we got any more?
There's one more that I found kind of general, but it piqued my imagination when I read it. I went and looked at the list of works and the checklist of works to see. But I'll read the question as it was written exactly. I noticed that none of the photographs have a title in this exhibition. Well, I found that of course is not true, but is this by design? If you do title your photographs, how do you do that? Is it based on true circumstances or your interpretation of what the image captured or something else? I would say maybe it's about the convention of titling and what does untitled mean if that's how it falls?
Well, before you guys weigh in, let me just tell the questioner that if you scroll down to the bottom, there's an asterisk where we introduce the images on the website. And if you scroll down to yet another asterisk, you will either have, you will have a list of individual titles for some of the images. And in the case of a couple of you, you've actually decided to name the series or the sequence of images, rather title the series or sequence of images. Now I'll leave it to you guys.
I do title most of my work. In this particular case, I didn't title the individual photographs because it's still a work in progress. And I think I usually wait till later on to title stuff individually. But it's also because I'm terrible at keeping notes on when I'm taking pictures in this case. And so a lot of the pictures, I think I need to go back and show them to my family to ask them when and where was this taken. And that usually helps me determine the title as well.
Anyone else want to weigh in? I've got a question if there's no other questions, or you guys don't want to answer this question further.
I think for me, what feels the best fit is to acknowledge the person that I'm photographing, unless that person does not want to be named. And sometimes that is the case. You know, they don't necessarily want their name attached to an image of their face. Does that make sense? You know, they would rather stay somewhat anonymous and maybe not as specific. So that I do try to keep it just a first name. And that could be for various reasons, but.
Guy, you got anything to add to this?
Nothing sophisticated, no. I've never offered an untitled image. I think it's like trying to keep track. As Whitman said, like trying to describe for myself, give myself a memory of that image.
You know, it's a remarkable thing. Titles in general, and this happens, man, it happens with abstract painting a lot. And it happens with photography, is that, you know, a lot of this is just literally keeping track. It's almost a registrar's issue. You know, titles often don't come in the way I think people would think they do, with a, you know, bout of inspiration where they basically are some kind of stand-in for, or some piece of meaning sort of overlaid on top of the image. Often, I think in your case, is the image speaks perfectly well without the aid of, you know, an extra overlay, though often or sometimes the overlay can be a wonderful addition. If you disagree with me, please do. But yeah, if not, listen. So I have Dave. Are we good there?
We're good, thank you.
Grand. So listen. I have, let's make this the last question, and we are way over, but I think this is, you know, really just a terrific conversation. So, for all you guys, how do you see in the situation we're in, both economically, socially, politically, health-wise, let's just go down the cascading demics, infodemic, pandemic, you know, racial reckoning, you know, it just all of it. When do you see yourselves going out to take pictures again? And how do you think the place that you go to take pictures again is going to have changed? As far as you can tell, and I know, Curran, you've just come back, so maybe you're a good place to start. What did it look like when you went and came back? You just had a COVID test.
Yeah. For me, it was kind of a unique circumstance personally, because we just welcomed the sun into the world. So we've been pretty much isolated, trying to figure out what parenting is, as much as that's even possible. So we haven't really left the house so much, aside from the grocery store or seeing a very small group of people in our bubble, for months. And then when I went to go photograph recently,
where'd you go?
I was in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. And yeah, I mean, it was disorienting and startling to step into communities and places in which there wasn't really a mask in sight. And in fact, wearing a mask was kind of a political statement in and of itself. So, you know, I was ridiculed constantly and kind of yelled at even once for wearing a mask. So that was kind of strange and unsettling. Yeah, I mean, the world is upside down right now. So I think that's just one of the aspects that comprise that trip. But yeah, it's hard to pinpoint in a few words, but the world was strange, to say the least.
Yeah. And Woodland, what do you think?
I'm still making work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know you are. You're taking pictures of Joe Biden.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
No, I mean, listen, it's not really a question. I mean, I'm just sort of like, you're already out and taking pictures, but I'm just sort of wondering what's going to be different. What is different if you're already out, sort of doing it, or maybe things are not so different for you. I don't know.
I think one of the things that I've been very fortunate in is that my work involves a lot of my family and close friends. So I think that hasn't changed much. And so when the pandemic started, I was in Syracuse and I had like a very tight-knit group of friends who we supported each other through it. And I was living alone at the time. So a lot of the only people I came in contact with them, they're also people that I photographed as well. And then I've been going to the city to visit my family, and I've been photographing my family as well. So for the most part, I think things have stayed the same in terms of like photographing my personal work, at least. When I go out into the world, I think it's shifted editorial wise. I think distance being one of the main things, distance and taking health precautions as well. Yeah.
Zora or Katya?
I mean, you know, I don't know. Tell me when it's safe to go outside again, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like, you know, my practice sort of shifted, you know, from like taking pictures out in the world to like, you know, like putting myself in front of the camera. I think it was like, I guess like, you know, trying to do this form of like self-assessment, you know, with this practice that I, you know, decided to invest the rest of my life in. And so, you know, it's important for me to figure out like, you know, if I'm going to go out into the world and make pictures of other people, I think I need to figure out like, how do I photograph myself first? So yeah, like, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now, but that's accomplishable, you know, like here, you know, at home. And yeah, and then I've been enjoying that, like making other things, like working with my hands and not necessarily worrying about, you know, like making my own photographs with a camera right now. So yeah.
Katya?
I'm kind of in a place where I feel like I've just sort of wrapped up a couple of things, and the next chapter that I want to work on is just going to be something very different. I don't know what that is, but maybe not necessarily photographing people, because I think that even though I do photograph in my family and in communities that I know, it just feels like people are very vulnerable right now. And I don't know, like it just doesn't feel right at the moment to enter communities at this moment. But I have this feeling that once this pandemic is over, we're going to walk out and it's going to be like that zombie moment, you know, where we're just all like, there's light. You know, I'm already feeling it when I've only gone to a few places, but I feel like not functioning it's just so indescribable, really.
Yeah, well, I can imagine it being like leaving the disco at like 6 o'clock in the morning with the birds chirping. Yeah, I can imagine that. That's kind of probably what it's going to feel like.
Like all of us, all across the
Yeah.
planet, we're gonna have that moment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. After having hibernated for 6, 8 months, 10 months, 12 months. Guy, you mentioned before, and again, you're the anchor man. You mentioned before that there were significant risks in photographing the community that you've been photographing for years because they don't take precautions. And that's an unfortunate thing. And again, I say that as their neighbor, right? Because I live right next to them. They're literally right across the street from me. So, what about you? What are your plans? What's it going to look like when you go back out there, as it were, or will you?
I've been in general just leaving my camera behind. I used to walk with it every day. During the pandemics, like the height, peak in New York City, I took some pictures of Central Park. I went to, early on, some of the protests, took photographs. I couldn't find my way with it. There's something, my own vulnerability, respecting other people's vulnerabilities in this moment, in really sort of desiring consent in a way that I don't always, although I'm starting to more and more. And the real prospect is that Mordechai, who's featured in some of these photographs, and his wife Hannah just had a new baby girl. Her name is Zelda, and he would like me to photograph her. So I'm invited. And I'll wear a mask. I won't feel ashamed about it. And in some Crown Heights, there's a lot more masks. Unfortunately, where you live, there are no masks.
Nope. Listen, that's a wonderful note to end on. Not the not wearing a mask, but Mordechai's child. Again, I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation, which for me has been tremendously enjoyable. Well, I wish there was a green room we could all retire to and have a drink. Fingers crossed we can do that sometime soon. And now we'll give way to Margaret, and Margaret will say goodbye for the institution.
And
and I say goodbye to you guys. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so
So you
much.
don't all have to go away. I just want to thank you all for this very engaging conversation. And I want to underscore what Christian said. I'd love to get you to Tampa when things open up and you feel comfortable traveling. We could do some kind of panel and sort of look through the images again and have you meet our students in our community. So thank you, Woodland. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Curran. Thank you, Katya. Thank you, Zora. Much, much appreciated. The lines that came up in the conversation, I took a few notes, which I think will help me have another richer experience with looking at your show. The urgency of the moment. We have to acknowledge who we are and what does it mean to be American and live in America, and how do we understand ourselves through photographs of others. So that conversation frames many of the ideas that you all present in your work. For all that are listening, I hope you'll go to the USF Contemporary Art Museum website. I loved it when Christian sort of talked about creating your own installation, blowing up the photographs as big as you can on your computer, and spending some time with each of these images. So please go to the USF Contemporary Art Museum website. If you are in Tampa and you are a student, on Monday, you can actually have access to the physical aspect of the exhibition. And you can make an appointment to come in at caminfo@usf.edu, or you can call the security desk, or you can just come to the museum. And if there's nobody else in, we'll practice, you wear your mask and we have social distancing. And it's actually an exhibition space that you can circumambulate all the way through and go out the other door without ever passing a single person. So we hope the students and faculty on the campus will do it, and soon our community supporters will come in and see this wonderful show. I want to make one other comment. If those of you who've watched this evening find that the images, and especially as you investigate the show, are compelling, and you happen to want to purchase some of the works that these wonderful artists have created, if you contact us, either through CAM Info or calling the line that's listed in the website, we will find a way to facilitate a relationship with the artists, and then you might be able to acquire some of their work. So I hope some of you will think about doing that. Christian has brought us so many wonderful artists that we just didn't know about before. I just have to say one personal line. I was standing next to Christian in the Whitney show, and he proposed this show looking at Curran Heidelberg's work. And so it's wonderful to meet you and see the work and see this project become a reality, even though, as Christian described, it took several different turns before it was fully realized. So I thank all of the amazing CAM staff, my amazing assistant, Mark Fredericks, and Don Fuller, and Ashley Jablonski, and Noelle Smith, all of the people that have put this together. And I'm sure you've all received loan forms from Shannon Annis so that everything is properly borrowed and documented. And thank you all for participating tonight and for bringing such a wonderful body of work to the attention of our community. Thank you. And good night, everybody.